They laughed first, because laughter was easier than listening. The man stood at the edge of the parade ground, with his coat buttoned wrong and his boots mismatched, a civilian amid uniforms. His name, written in a thin, careful hand on the requisition form, had already been misspelled twice by the time it reached headquarters. The clerk snorted. The junior officers passed it along with smirks. By the time the paper reached a general's desk, the name meant nothing at all. What he carried meant even less. He had arrived without escort, without rank, without the confident swagger of men who knew the army would have to take them seriously. He carried only a leather satchel, worn soft at the corners, and a stack of notebooks bound with twine. He asked for 15 minutes before the daily briefing. He was given 3. They told him to be quick. He spoke quietly, which forced people to lean in, though most did not. He did not predict victory or defeat. He did not speak of heroism, strategy, or honor. He spoke of numbers that did not add up, of supply routes that bent like crooked bones, of troop movements that followed patterns no one else seemed to notice because no one else had thought to look for them. He spoke of time, of days counted wrong, of reports delayed by hours that mattered more than men understood. A colonel chuckled openly. Someone at the back mimed winding a clock. The man did not stop. He said entire divisions would disappear if orders were not changed. Not destroyed, not defeated, vanished. That word finally earned him the room's attention, though only as a joke. Vanished suggested magic, superstition, or madness, and the army had little patience for any of the 3. The general glanced at his watch and told the man his time was up. "You'll lose 3 divisions in 6 weeks, the man said calmly, as if reciting a grocery list. Not to enemy fire, to movement. That earned him applause. Sarcastic, loud, dismissive. The man closed his notebook. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply asked where he should submit his findings for the record. This produced another wave of laughter, followed by an adjutant pointing him toward a filing office so overburdened that paper went there to die. The man nodded, thanked them for their time, and left. No one remembered his face afterward. Only the sound of laughter lingered, echoing off the high ceiling long after the briefing moved on to matters everyone understood. Maps with clean lines, arrows drawn in confident strokes, plans that assumed the world would behave as it always had. Outside, the day was grey and damp. The man crossed the yard slowly, counting his steps without appearing to. He paused once to watch a column of soldiers march past, boots striking the ground in perfect rhythm. He watched their faces, young and older, focused and bored, alive with certainty. He marked the time it took them to pass. He wrote nothing down. The war had been underway long enough for patterns to harden into doctrine. Men trusted what had worked before. The man trusted only what he could prove, and even then, only provisionally. His notebooks were filled with crossed-out conclusions, revised assumptions, arrows pointing backward instead of forward. Where others saw momentum, he saw friction. Where others saw order, he saw accumulation. Tiny errors stacking atop one another until they became something else entirely. He had not always been an outsider. Once, years earlier, he had worn a uniform too. He had believed in the machine then, believed it could be understood if one simply learned its rules. He learned them well enough to see where they failed. That was when he had begun to be ignored. In the weeks that followed, his report was stamped, logged, and buried beneath requests for boots, ammunition, and replacement horses. His name was misspelled a 3rd time. A note in the margin suggested psychological evaluation, written as a joke. No evaluation was ordered. 6 weeks passed. The 1st Division did not return from a routine redeployment. There was no battle report, no casualty list, no radio transmission beyond a single broken message that ended mid-sentence. Command assumed delay, then confusion, then sabotage. Search parties were dispatched along expected routes and found nothing, no bodies, no equipment, no sign that thousands of men had ever been there at all. Maps were redrawn. 2 weeks later, the 2nd Division vanished. Panic crept in then, thin and sharp. Officers spoke in lowered voices. The word vanished was no longer funny. It was not spoken aloud in briefings, but it appeared in the spaces between sentences, in the way men avoided each other's eyes. Someone remembered the man with the notebooks. By the time they went looking for him, the 3rd Division was already on the move. They found him where men like him were easiest to overlook. Not at a university, not in a government office, not even in the margins of military. Bureaucracy where forgotten consultants sometimes drifted. He was living in a rented room above a shuttered print shop, its windows coated with dust and old slogans fading into the brick. The landlady knew him only as a quiet tenant who paid on time and asked for extra lamp oil. When the officers arrived, they came without ceremony. No formal summons, no escort of honor, just 2 uniforms at the door, boots wet from rain, faces tight with something that was not quite fear, but close enough to recognize. He answered immediately, as if he had been expecting them. They told him a division was missing. "I know," he said. They told him a 2nd was gone as well. "I know." When they demanded how, when, and why he knew, he stepped aside to let them in. The room smelled of paper and ink. Notebooks covered every surface. Tables, chairs, even the narrow bed. The walls were pinned with maps layered over one another, translucent sheets tracing movements that overlapped but never aligned. Lines bent, arrows looped back on themselves. Dates were written, crossed out, rewritten in different ink. The officers stood in silence, suddenly aware of how little space there was for them to exist inside the man's thinking. "You said 3 divisions," one of them finally muttered. "Yes." "Where is the 3rd? The man did not answer immediately. He walked to the wall and touched a spot on a map where 3 supply corridors converged into a single valley. His finger rested there lightly, almost tenderly. "On schedule," he said. They took him back that night, not as an honored expert, but as a liability they could no longer ignore. Word of his prediction had spread unevenly through headquarters, enough to unsettle, not enough to convince. Some officers treated him like a lucky madman. Others treated him like a threat, the kind that made men look foolish after the fact. He was given a desk in a windowless room near logistics. No rank, no authority, only access. That was enough. He worked, without pause, reconstructing movements not from official plans, but from the gaps between them. He ignored after-action reports and focused instead on transit logs, fuel requisitions, weather delays, and amended orders stamped hours too late. Where others saw isolated failures, he saw resonance, small deviations amplifying one another as units tried to correct course independently, each adjustment pulling them further from coherence. The divisions had not walked into ambushes. They had walked out of the war. Columns rerouted to avoid non-existent threats, supply trains redirected to support units that had already moved on. Communication relays shifted locations hours before messages arrived. Each decision was reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a maze with no center. Men marched until maps stopped matching the land. Then they marched some more. By the time headquarters realized what was happening, the 3rd Division had already crossed the threshold the man had marked weeks earlier. Orders were sent to halt, then to regroup, then to return. None arrived in time. The last confirmed sighting placed the division moving south, though no southern route existed on any current map. They vanished within 48 hours. This time, the army did not laugh. An emergency council was convened. The man was brought in and seated at the far end of the table, still without insignia, still officially nothing. Generals spoke over one another, demanding explanations that sounded dangerously like absolution. They wanted an enemy. They wanted sabotage, espionage, betrayal, anything that could be punished and thus controlled. "There is no enemy responsible for this," the man said when allowed to speak. "Only accumulation." They asked him if the divisions were alive. "I don't know," he replied. "Eventually, probably not." Silence followed. Not the dismissive kind this time, but the heavy, immobile silence of men forced to confront a problem with no precedent and no clean edge. "What happens next?" someone asked. The man closed his eyes briefly. He had not slept. "Nothing," he said, "if you stop moving." That answer did not satisfy them. Armies existed to move. Stopping felt like surrender, like inviting annihilation. Yet movement now had become dangerous in ways no doctrine addressed. They compromised, as institutions always did. Limited advances, controlled withdrawals, more oversight layered onto systems already strained, more reports, more confirmations, more delays. The man watched it happen and wrote faster. The vanishings did not stop, they spread. Smaller units first, battalions delayed, companies misrouted, patrols swallowed by administrative fog. Men began to disappear between morning roll call and nightfall without ever hearing a shot. The front lines grew quiet in places no one had ordered to be quiet. Soldiers whispered about cursed roads and invisible enemies. Officers blamed each other. Maps multiplied. Through it all, the man remained. At his desk, tracing the shape of a war collapsing under its own complexity. He knew now that the army had waited too long. The system was past correction. Too many compensations had been made for errors no one wanted to admit. When a young lieutenant asked him, in a moment of desperation, whether the vanishings could be reversed, the man shook his head. "You can't rewind accumulation," he said. "Only stop adding to it." That night, as rain battered the headquarters roof and couriers ran, messages no one would fully read, the man wrote a final projection in red ink. The war would not end with a defeat. It would thin, fragment, and dissolve until there was nothing left to command. By the third month, the army had begun to shrink without anyone issuing an order for it to do so. There were still uniforms, still salutes, still morning briefings delivered with practiced authority, but the substance beneath them thinned daily. Headquarters spoke in numbers that no longer matched reality. Strength reports arrived already obsolete. Entire regiments existed only as ink, their men last seen weeks earlier marching toward objectives that had since been redefined, relocated, or quietly abandoned. The man became indispensable without ever becoming trusted. They consulted him in private, then ignored his conclusions in public. His name did not appear in official memoranda, only in penciled margins and whispered references. The civilian, they called him, the analyst. Never by name. To name him would be to admit he had been right when it mattered. He warned them about feedback loops, about commands reacting to the consequences of earlier commands without recognizing the connection, about a war now governed less by intention than by inertia. He drew diagrams showing how attempts to stabilize the front only displaced instability elsewhere, like pressure shifting beneath a sealed lid. Most listened politely. Some listened carefully. Few acted. The vanishings began to change character. Where divisions had once dissolved wholesale, now they eroded. A battalion would arrive at a staging area with half its men missing, no one able to say when or where they had fallen away. Supply convoys reached destinations with cargo intact and no recipients waiting. Field hospitals stood ready with empty beds, then overflowed days later with wounded from units no longer listed as active. Men learned, slowly and instinctively, that the safest place in the war was not the front, but the margin. Those who hesitated, who lagged behind a column or took shelter during a confused redeployment, often survived longer than those who followed orders precisely. Discipline, once a shield, became a risk. Desertion increased, though the word itself lost clarity. Could one desert an army that could no longer locate itself? The man watched morale decay with the same detachment he applied to supply failures. He did not judge. Judgment required stable categories, and those were disappearing too. He focused instead on thresholds, points beyond which behavior changed irreversibly. He marked the day when officers stopped correcting maps and began annotating them with questions. He noted when phrases like "as ordered" vanished from reports, replaced by "as encountered." One evening, a general asked him whether the enemy understood what was happening. "Yes," the man said, "they understand you're doing it to yourselves." That answer did not bring comfort. Attempts were made to reassert control. Centralized command structures were reinforced, then bypassed when they proved too slow. Autonomous units were empowered, then blamed when autonomy produced divergence. Each reform added another layer of contradiction. Orders arrived instructing units to hold position and advance simultaneously, to conserve fuel while accelerating movement, to await confirmation that could only arrive if movement continued. The man stopped predicting dates. The system had become too chaotic for precise forecasts. Instead, he described shapes. Collapse would no longer be dramatic. There would be no single moment of realization, no clear announcement of failure. The war would simply become impossible to finish because no one could define where it was still being fought. Then something unexpected happened. A corps commander, tired, obscure, and dangerously pragmatic, followed the man's advice fully and without compromise. He halted all movement within his sector. No advances, no withdrawals, no redeployments to optimize positions. Supply routes were frozen in place. Communication lines were simplified, not expanded. For the first time in months, nothing vanished. The sector grew quiet, not the brittle quiet of abandonment, but a cautious stillness, as if the war itself were holding its breath. Reports stabilized. Counts began to match reality again. Men stopped drifting. The result should have been celebrated. Instead, it terrified headquarters. A stationary corps exposed the truth too clearly. That motion itself had become the danger, that the grand strategies demanded by leadership were now actively destructive. To accept the success of stillness would be to admit that the war, as conceived, was no longer executable. Orders were issued to resume operations. The corps complied. Within a week, it began to unravel like the rest. The man recorded the failure without comment. He had hoped, briefly, that someone might choose containment over ambition. Hope, he reminded himself, was not an analytic tool. By the time winter set in, the front lines existed only as approximations. The enemy advanced in some places, stalled in others, but increasingly found no organized resistance at all, only scattered formations, isolated strongpoints, and long stretches of empty terrain where an army had once been. When the man wrote his final assessment for the High Command, he used a phrase none of them liked. "The army is no longer an instrument," he wrote. "It is an environment, and environments did not obey orders. Winter did not stop the war, it clarified it. Snow covered abandoned positions and filled trenches no one manned anymore. Roads that once strained under constant traffic fell silent, their surfaces hardening into pale ribbons, stretching nowhere in particular. The cold did what months of reports had failed to do. It stripped away illusion. What remained was an army spread too thin to recognize itself, scattered across distances measured more in paperwork than in miles. The man moved through headquarters like a ghost given temporary substance. He was no longer mocked. That, somehow, felt worse. Officers sought him out in corridors, speaking quickly, urgently, as if speed alone could undo months of delay. They asked him how to retrieve units that had drifted beyond communication, how to restore coherence without movement, how to end a war that no longer presented a clear edge. He had no answers that fit their needs. "What you're asking for," he told one general, "is a way to reverse time without acknowledging it." The general did not like that. He asked whether the man understood the political consequences of inaction, of admitting paralysis. "I understand accumulation," the man replied. "Politics accumulates too." As the enemy advanced into zones that had once been fiercely contested, they encountered less resistance than expected. Not surrender exactly. There were still firefights, still artillery in isolated bursts, but no continuity. Captured soldiers could not say which units they belonged to. Some carried outdated orders weeks old. Others had been resupplied by convoys that no longer officially existed. Intelligence reports grew surreal. Enemy officers described advancing through territory already administratively abandoned. They spoke of finding intact depots with no guards, hospitals with staff waiting for patients who never arrived, command posts meticulously maintained and utterly empty. The man read these reports carefully. They confirmed what he had already concluded. The army had not been defeated. It had exceeded its own capacity for coordination. In late winter, headquarters ordered a comprehensive consolidation. Every remaining unit was to fall back toward a reduced number of hubs. The intention was clarity. The result was density. Routes converged. Traffic multiplied. Conflicting priorities collided. Units that had survived by staying peripheral were forced back into the system that had destroyed coherence in the first place. The man warned them quietly once more. No one listened this time because listening would have meant stopping. The consolidation collapsed in days. Supplies jammed. Commands contradicted each other faster than they could be resolved. Officers made decisions based on partial information and then revised them before the consequences could even be observed. Men waited for orders that arrived after the moment they applied to, and so they waited some more. The man watched the process with a detached grief, not for the army itself, but for the wasted opportunity of understanding. The vanishings had been a lesson, brutally clear, and it had been ignored at every level. The institution had chosen familiarity over adaptation, momentum over stability. One night, as snow fell thick enough to mute the sound of distant guns, the man packed his notebooks into the same leather satchel he had carried months before. He left copies behind. Not for leadership, but for archivists. History, he believed, might listen where power had not. No one stopped him when he walked out. By spring, the war's shape had changed completely. The enemy held more ground, but spoke cautiously of it, unsure what it meant to occupy spaces that seemed already hollow. The army still existed in name, still issued communiques, still planned operations that never fully materialized. It had become what the man had written, an environment. Dangerous, not because of intent, but because of inertia, and environments once formed were difficult to escape. The war did not end with a treaty. It ended with silence that no one knew how to announce. By early summer, headquarters still issued daily summaries. Though fewer people read them, the language grew vague, then ritualistic. Phrases repeated themselves with minor variations, as if consistency might substitute for relevance. Operations ongoing. Situation developing. Command remains confident. Confidence, by then, had become a stylistic choice rather than a condition. Units still existed on paper. Some even existed in fact, though isolated, reduced, and increasingly autonomous in ways no doctrine had prepared them for. Officers made decisions based not on strategy, but on weather, terrain, and the immediate temperament of their men. In some sectors, informal truces emerged simply because neither side could determine who was supposed to advance. The enemy adapted faster, but not triumphantly. They learned to move cautiously, to probe rather than push, to avoid becoming entangled in the same accumulations that had hollowed out the army they faced. They stopped pursuing decisive engagements and focused instead on occupying what remained stable. Victory redefined meant not dissolving. Some months after he left headquarters, the man was interviewed by a small commission tasked with documenting the conflict while it was still recognizable as one. They found him in a coastal town, living modestly, working in a weather station that had lost most of its funding. He agreed to speak on the condition that nothing be attributed to him by name. They asked him when he realized the army could not recover. "When it chose correction over comprehension," he said. "You can't fix what you refuse to understand." They asked him whether the vanishings would be studied in the future. "Yes," he replied, "but incorrectly." He explained that people would look for dramatic causes, secret weapons, brilliant enemy maneuvers, internal betrayal. They would resist the idea that complexity itself could become lethal, that systems built to manage violence could collapse without a single decisive blow. "They'll say it was inevitable," one commissioner said. "No," the man answered, "it was optional, every step of it." By autumn, the front lines were gone. Not moved, gone. What remained were pockets of authority, negotiated zones, stretches of land where uniforms appeared. Only intermittently, like reminders of a former order. The war had not been won or lost. It had been outpaced by its own mechanisms. When the final communiqué was issued, it did not declare peace. It announced a transition. Responsibilities were reassigned. Commands were restructured. The language suggested continuation, but nothing followed. Men went home when they could. Some never did. Records were closed with annotations instead of conclusions. Years later, military academies taught the conflict as a cautionary example. Cadets studied diagrams that resembled the man's notebooks more than the clean arrows of traditional doctrine. They learned about accumulation, feedback loops, and the dangers of unmanaged complexity. His name appeared occasionally in footnotes, misspelled more often than not. The army never officially acknowledged that it had mocked him. It did not need to. The divisions that vanished were never fully accounted for, not because their men had all died, but because the institution that might have counted them no longer existed in a coherent form. The army had not been destroyed. It had simply exceeded the limits of its own understanding, and in doing so, it had proven the man's quiet warning true. An army does not have to lose a war. Sometimes it only has to keep moving.